So, welcome everyone. My guest today is Maxwell. I'd like to welcome him to my channel. Thank you for coming on, Max.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to someone when I'm stuck in the house for so long.
I'm glad we finally got to do this. So, today we're gonna talk a bit about the Socratic Dialog or the Socratic Method. Max is going to give us some background. He's an expert on it. He's been practicing it for a long time, and then he's going to interview me, so to speak. He's going to be the Socratic questioner. I'm going to be the interlocutor here. So, at least I think, anyway. But
Yes.
Max can introduce the topic. He knows a lot more about it than I do.
Thank you. And I was first introduced to Plato as a teenager. I would have to say that I'm not really an expert, depending on how you define that. I have my own idiosyncratic take on it and a lot of experience with that. And so when I was a teenager, I managed to pretty much wipe myself out. Did things I shouldn't have been doing. Didn't pay enough attention in school. By the time I was 19, I had no vision. I had no ambition. I had no interest. I pretty much just sat around and did nothing. I mean, I could get up and go to work if I had to, but just didn't assert myself in any way past what I had to do just to survive. And one day I was just sitting, and an acquaintance of mine saw me sitting there, and he knew this habit of mine, and he was disgusted with it. So he picked up a book off the shelf, they weren't my books, and threw it at me and hit me in the chest, landed in my lap, and he said with a tone of disgust, "If you're going to just sit there, at least read something." And so I'm like, okay. So I picked up the book, and it was a book of philosophy readings. And the first thing I read was Plato's Euthyphro. And in it, I met this character, Socrates, who was asking questions like, what is piety? And now piety was a term I heard before, and I thought I knew what it meant, but I realized that he was asking questions the way I'd never heard before, and it was electrifying. And I went on to read the beginning of Plato's Republic, where the question was, what is justice? And now that was a term that I thought if I needed to know what it meant, I just pick up a dictionary, boom, done.
Yeah.
I know what justice is. And I came to realize that no matter how many dictionaries I had on my shelf, I couldn't account for this word. There was something missing. Everything I knew was somehow shallow. I wasn't really engaged with it. And within a month of that experience, I had dedicated the rest of my life to the pursuit of philosophy, to the pursuit of knowledge. I think the principle in play was the more unstable you are, the greater your capacity for change. So I was really ready for a change at that time. And so that began. That was in 1981. And the next big influence in my life, which shaped how my relationship with this whole Socratic thing would pan out over the next decades, was I met a guy named Gandhi. And the title of his autobiography, and I met him, so to speak, through the movie that came out, I believe, in the end of '82, which caused me to want to read his writings. And the title of his autobiography really said it all. The title is "The Story of My Experiments with Truth." And what I learned from Gandhi is that when you read a text and you get new ideas or come across new principles, that you don't just keep them in your mind like data. You have to use them. You have to apply them. You have to experiment with the truth. You have to try out new ideas, try out principles. And so that became my pattern. And that pattern grew over the years. Now I call it participatory philology. When you have the study of a text and the study of your own being merging together into one thing. And so a recent example of that, and this is sort of this is my own idiosyncratic style of living an examined life, not necessarily meant as a model or example for anybody. But so my co-author and I are working on the fundamentals of education. When I started that, part one was based on George Steiner's book, Real Presences. And his thesis was that the focus of academic literature on the arts is often more about other academic literature than it is about the primary creative text, music, and other arts they claim to study. So I decided to live his solution, which was that there needs to be more original creation, more performance of art, and more personal human witness of art in the academic state of the arts. So I lived that for 4 years with a piano. And I picked out a couple examples, to talk about in part one, playing a Beethoven sonata, playing a piece by Rachmaninoff. And I took the experience of being an artist. This was the participatory part. And I reread Steiner as an artist. And it taught me things about myself and Steiner that I couldn't have gotten in any other way. The end result of that was simply to emphasize one principle, that the foundation of human living, of all human willful living, is to have hospitality to our own being, hospitality to ourselves. And in the context of the examined life, that's about questioning ourselves and feeling not only comfortable about it, but good about it. And there's a lot of people that are afraid to question their knowledge, to question their character, question their principles. And anyways, over the decades, what I learned about the Socratic method, and this is my idiosyncratic take on it, is that first, there's not just one method. Even Plato has a diversity of methods. And so I've sort of moved to thinking of it as a style of conversation, a Socratic style, so to speak, that can accommodate a whole diversity of modalities. And also, the method is not an end in itself. It is an expression of the self in the context of a commitment to live an examined life, where seeking knowledge and seeking the virtue of character to be able to subordinate our willful living to knowledge is at the heart of it. So that means that there can be a lot of things as part of an examined life that's not really Socratic method per se, maybe not even related to Plato per se. One example was I worked for 7 years as a research and development project manager for a company that invented new ways of teaching. And I got paid to learn, which was just fantastic. I was like, wow. Because one of the main things I got out of this attachment to the examined life was this tremendous love of learning. I mean, it fills my whole being. I really, really like it. So at that job, I got paid to learn how to make animated cartoons, learn how to write orchestral music, play piano and violin, learn steady languages. It was sort of a dream job in ways. And so for me, the Socratic method is not this isolated exercise. It's part of a complex of things that could have extraordinary diversity. For me, that was an expression of an examined life, expressing my love of learning. So the most famous portrait of Socrates, in which he's constantly refuting definitions, in Euthyphro, which was the first dialogue I read, he's asking him what is piety. He gets an answer. He asks more questions, which wind up refuting the definition. This happens several times. The end of a lot of the dialogues, it's kind of like, well, I guess we don't know what we're talking about. And that has given the impression, and particularly the law school version, in law school, that's sort of the lawyer's fantasy, to ask questions so powerful that it just overthrows your opponent in court, and you just have this magic power of questioning. And problem with that is there's a lot of faulty arguments in Plato. A lot of times where Plato obviously wants us to think the characters believe that this definition or this premise has been refuted. Well, today we can look at it and say, well, you know what, that's not correct. That they did not refute that premise. But that would only be a problem if we think that's the goal, if that's the purpose. And I don't see the refutations of definitions or premises or forcing people into some corner as even remotely the goal of the Socratic method. The goal is to help us see that our understanding's not as complete or as sound as we want. So even in Euthyphro, when he technically did not refute the premise, it did get him to think a little more. It did draw him into it a little more. And so to me, that's the important part. And the purpose is to draw ourselves into a greater enthusiasm to question ourselves, our ideas, our knowledge, character, and living practices. One of the rules that I have of when I evaluate myself or anything pertaining to an actual use of so-called Socratic method is that if it doesn't make people more interested in questioning, it has failed. It doesn't matter if I question someone and I perfectly refute everything they could possibly say in classic Socratic style. If at the end of it they're less interested in questioning, or afraid of questioning themselves, then I've messed up somehow. So to me, for me, it's more pragmatic in terms of the idea is more about it being a facilitation of exchanging perspective, exchanging information. So hold on, I just messed up something on my screen here. Okay. And it's also the nature of these questions. These timeless questions in Plato: what is justice? What is virtue? The justice and virtue of human character, the beauty and goodness of life. These are questions that have been asked for thousands of years since Plato, and there is to this day not a final answer.
Yeah.
And so these kinds of questions are at home with faulty and incomplete arguments. And if we engage them, we will have faulty and incomplete arguments. So this idea of some logical perfection of magically overturning people's premises, I think, is just entirely a misperception of what's best in Socratic dialogue. Yeah. And and it's also why the great warning to me, the greatest part of the legacy of Plato is it's not the structure of the Republic or his theory of anamnesis, and it's not the sort of law school interpretation of Socrates, all of which have taken up a lot of attention in our civilization. It's just this simple warning that we see in the character of Socrates, this warning not to trust our knowing too much. Like, for example, when I was a child, I learned how to tie my shoes. And I practiced that knowledge until I had the skill mastered. And as soon as I learned how to tie my shoes, I promptly forgot all about it, and I did it on rote. I memorized it. To this day, if I have to tie shoelaces, I just do it exactly the same way as when I was a child. Yeah. What Plato is telling us through Socrates is that we cannot do that with our understanding of justice and virtue and temperance and courage and beauty and goodness, that we have to keep the mind open to questions, open to new possibilities. And that's an essential part of human character if we want to be well. And that's why George Steiner once wrote that if we lost everything, the whole of modern civilization, but we still had Plato, we could rebuild everything. And I believe the reason we could do that is this ideal of the examined life, where we keep our mind open to the most important questions.
Yeah, very good.
And just to sum that off, is that what I see as the most valuable common structures are really simple things that aren't even Socratic, so to speak. So, for example, the structure where one person limits themselves to questions and another person just gives the answers, you actually get more data that way, as compared to the debate format common in political conversations where people are beating each other over the head with counterclaims. It shuts down communication. It shuts down the exchange of information. The other, number two, the most important thing is examining ideas with no attachment. This is the hard part for a lot of people to learn. No attachment to whether or not your idea survives. If you can question your own most cherished principles with no attachment, maybe it'll die right in front of you because you'll learn something new or you'll get better knowledge and you have to throw it out and trade it for something else. That's kind of a scary thing, but if you can learn to be comfortable with that, it really brings your own mind to life in your own living. And number three is just the simple capacity to stay on topic. And ironically, you could have a Socratic dialogue asking, how do we define what is Socratic in the Socratic method, and fail to be able to do it. Because the basics of it aren't Socratic, they're just human.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very good. No, it is hard. You mentioned number two. It is really hard to separate yourself from an idea that you're attached to. I've called that in my writing thinking with with distance, or trying to think with a greater degree of distance. So you're not so wedded to an idea that it's making you irrational, in defending it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just reading John Rawls' stuff about his veil of ignorance as a technique where you pretend you don't know who you are, and it kind of frees you up to analyze anything without some of those personal attachments. Okay. Any questions about background or general comments on Socratic, or we can go into testing a dialogue if you want.
Well, I did a prior video and some, or maybe two prior videos, I can't remember, where I gave a little bit of information about the Socratic dialogue. So I guess we can just get right into it, because I can put links in this video to those. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Um, the focus I've chosen on, one of the things about the Socratic dialogue presented in Plato is they're historically and culturally relevant to their time.
Yeah.
So you have in Laches, Socrates is talking to two Athenian generals about courage. And you have in Plato's Republic a group of citizens who, in a Periclean democracy, are required to participate in the governance of the nation. So it doesn't seem strange for them to design the state.
Yeah.
Whereas we would think that was kind of weird. Like, what are we doing? Redesigning the Constitution? What's going on with that? For our time, I think one of the most important topics is what I would consider to be the collapse of reason in talk about political and social issues. Where, so for example, I could make a claim and tell you that framing all political talk in terms of partisan divisions and using ad hominem arguments is wrong. And frankly, a lot of people, you could say that, and they could tell you whether or not they agreed, or they might be on the same page. But if you get resistance, and some people have a vested interest in wanting to see all political talk done exclusively in partisan terms.
Yeah, absolutely.
And exclusively through ad hominem argument. If you happen to meet one of those people, what I find is I can't just keep making claims and hearing counterclaims. I have to just lower it to a level of just simpler questions and give up. The other person has the stage, and the best I hope for is I draw them out into a conversation, and sometimes it goes nowhere. But you know what? It's always more useful than that counterclaim punching fest that happens when people get defensive about their ideas. So, for example, on this, do you mind if I ask you some questions about a political talk?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, for example, if I wanted to draw you into a conversation about the value of, what is the nature of political talk relative to what I just told you, I asked, like, for example, does anyone talk about, we're talking about human character I'm sorry, I'm going to digress just a minute more just to set this up. My concern is in political talk, as it's demonstrated publicly and participated in private by a great many citizens, focuses too much on human character of individuals and groups in a way that's dissociated. So I could ask you, does anyone talk about human character of an astrophysicist, such as their sexual habits or how much they lie, and then wind up thinking that they're talking about the science of astrophysics? Is that something that we would do, or would we recognize that those are two different subjects?
Not everyone would recognize it.
So if I was talking with someone who didn't recognize it, I would get more specific. And perhaps if they didn't recognize that, I might want to choose something other than astrophysics. So maybe carpentry. So what is carpentry about? Well, you can get them easily to admit that carpentry is about making things out of wood. And so you could ask, does anyone talk about the ethics of a carpenter, like how lazy they are, or maybe that they steal, whether or not they steal? And is this the same as talking about making things out of wood? So if you make it more specific in a practical way, relatively few people are going to be able to bridge that one. Now, I would point out that the most important thing is trust. I find if I'm not careful, sometimes I fling ideas and questions around, and if I'm not sensitive to someone, to whether or not they're feeling comfortable or invited, if they think you're just setting them up to beat them over the head, you'll get more resistance. But I tend to just adopt the position that I don't know people. In fact, my co-author sorry for the tangents. I'm not sure how organized we want this, but my co-author reminds me regularly that I need to pay better attention to her, that I need to really listen, that she has something to say that's different from something that I know, and somehow I'm getting caught up in my own ideas, and I'm not hearing her.
Well, I have that problem too.
And our whole relationship for almost 40 years has been steeped in conversations, very detailed conversations, and yet I don't know her completely.
Yeah.
So that assumption about if you can express an enthusiasm to discover the other person, it invites them to fill up their space. So that tangent aside,
yeah.
So let's assume now that most people would actually agree with that. So let's just kind of proceed as if. And you could also ask questions like when astrophysicists or carpenters disagree with their respective subjects. Do they resolve disagreements? Is it seen as proper to resolve disagreements by talking about each other personally? Or do they have to consult the knowledge of their respective trade or science in order to determine what's best? I mean, now that's an abstract way to put it, but you can get into more specific, detailed things like, well, if I want to make a miter cut, some people say in carpentry that you have to cut it at a 45-degree angle. And, but if someone disagreed, there are references that we could look up. We could look this up and determine it. But so if you do a miter cut differently than me, does me talking about how I think you're not trustworthy have anything to do with figuring out how to do a miter cut? Or if we disagree about a sum of numbers. So, and you might be recognized that these questions sound like Socrates' obsession with the trades and the arts. If you disagreed about a sum of numbers, does it make any sense whatsoever for us to say, well, you cheated on your wife. You don't know anything about math. Or you did some horrible thing over here, or your political philosophy is this or that, or it doesn't. So staying on topic and consulting knowledge. Now, this is easy to do when everybody knows that carpentry is absolutely uncontroversially about making stuff out of wood.
Yeah.
But so the purpose of carpentry is to make stuff out of wood, but what is the purpose of governing a nation?
Yes, absolutely.
Here we don't have agreement, and this is the problem.
Yeah.
The art of painting is about producing a painting. No controversy whatsoever. But what is the art of living well? What is the purpose of that? And here we start to get wildly differing interpretations. And what happens is when we can't agree on the end goal of politics, it's hard to hold ourselves accountable to the knowledge of politics in the same way. And so what this means is that, for me, one of the most important philosophy conversations we could have is, what is the purpose of politics? So that would be these kind of questions that I was asking you would lead into the question of, should we include politics in this? Does human character and individuals and groups? And if you can get someone to go there, at least open to the idea, then it's shouldn't we also know the purpose of politics? So what would you say that is the purpose of politics? If we're going to talk about carpentry, we know the purpose is make stuff out of wood, because we're going to be talking about making stuff out of wood. But what's the purpose of politics?
Probably to form some kind of utilitarian consensus, because otherwise there's too many ideas for things to work as well. Without sort of, I mean, if you say politics, I guess I'm thinking more in terms of political parties. But yeah, I guess probably it's more of a consensus. Politics is more of a consensus forming apparatus, right?
Okay, so if we wanted to conform a consensus about health in the body, would we consult politicians or would we consult doctors?
Doctor.
Okay, so as you can see, this is a standard thing that Socrates did, where if you make a statement of a definition that could be applied to any trade or art, we have to get more specific.
Yeah.
Sorry, I keep doing tangents. Maybe that's not the right thing to do for this interview. I should just stick to the questions. But I just fill in comments here and there. So, you said it's about forming a consensus, but what is the focus of the consensus? So it still leaves the purpose of politics unclear if we don't know what the focus of that consensus. What are we forming a consensus about? That pertains precisely to the purpose of politics.
Well, the consensus would be for various interests to advance their agenda, I suppose. And
is there anything that politics produces that it's supposed to produce? Like I know, again with carpentry, and you could use whatever trades you want as a metaphor or as an analogy. But carpentry produces something that's wood. Medicine produces health. Stonemasonry produces objects made of stone. Does politics produce anything? If it's an art, some people call it an art. Many people call it a science, as in political science. A lot of people live it as a trade. But all of the arts, trades, and sciences produce something
Yeah.
that you can describe. What does politics produce?
Indirectly, I guess it produces things. I don't know. I have trouble with the term politics, but it's definitely different from government.
Okay, well, if you want to define the purpose of government, I'd be willing to accept that. I don't get too stuck on the terms.
Sure.
So for me, when I think of the purpose of politics, I think of government.
Yeah.
So, and this is something I want to bring up about the purpose of the Socratic method. There's this. Did you ever hear of semantic incommensurability? That's when two people can use the same word or read the same text and come away with wildly different interpretations.
Yeah.
So if we read the same poem, we could have a totally different understanding of what that means. That's a high level of semantic incommensurability.
Yeah.
But if we read a different kind of literature, say the owner's manual on how to use a toaster, that's a low level of semantic incommensurability. And that's what Socratic conversation strives for, is to minimize semantic, we want to minimize the differences of meaning. So here we just exchanged information about, when you think of politics, you weren't really thinking of government. When I think of politics, I was. Making that clear and explicit and coming to agreements of terms is an important part of really any rational dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so maybe the purpose of government would be the question we should ask. Do you think that would be good?
Yeah, that's actually why I started this whole series of videos, was to do sort of examine that. So that's a great place to be.
Okay, so I don't mind switching. Instead of saying the purpose of politics, what is the purpose of government? I typically see politicians as engaging that most directly, and that the political art has to address governance somehow. But we can just say the purpose of government if you're like that better. That's fine.
Sure. Well, I don't have a satisfactory answer to that. That's why I wanted to start this inquiry. But
You do realize that I'll be the most ignorant one when we do this, so I'm not. I may not have answers too. Now, at this point, though, I would like to say, in Plato, sometimes, and it's not done a great deal, but sometimes they refer to their poets and they refer to their history and they refer to other thinkers and stuff. Socrates had a tendency to say, "Hey, I don't want to hear about that. What do you think?" But it is completely valid that if you have a resource that everyone shares in common. And that in common phrase is important. To discuss it in a helpful way is good. So, for example, in the Constitution, there are statements of purpose in the preamble that might give information to at least start conversations. So, for example, the Constitution preamble says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union," that's one. "Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So here, "in order to" is a statement of purpose. And as far as the Founding Fathers are concerned, that was the Constitution itself went some step towards fulfilling that. But so, I want to ask you some questions about what you think about this. For example, regarding establishing justice, it seems to me a pretty important one to start with. Like, can you have domestic tranquility in the complete absence of justice?
Probably
if there was no
not.
justice whatsoever, and would anyone be safe in such a society? Providing for the common defense, but if there's no justice whatsoever within the society, would anyone be safe at all, anyways? And so, So
well, we have to define justice. We have to attempt to define justice because
absolutely the next question is, what is justice?
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I don't know. Some people think it's more of a personality trait, to be honest, like of a sort of fairness, but in the modern sense, it's more of something that's kind of imposed upon us, like a system of law or of rules.
Right. And I'd like to point out at this point, coming right away to going, I don't know. I mean, Socrates would see you as being better off
Yeah.
than someone who was absolutely convinced they had the understanding of something,
Yeah.
but was mistaken. This is a better position. I have gloried in my ignorance. Whenever I try to learn something new, realizing that I don't know has been one of the healthiest things in my life. So with justice, now, one of the things, like, I still have, we each have different ideas about what it could be. And if the flow of exchange is good, I would say that, if the flow of exchange is good, it's not even necessary to imitate any Socratic style. If you have a really optimal exchange of information, then the conversation is already healthy. But so, for example, I would be curious. I'm still going to ask questions. But you said you don't really know what justice is, and yet, when the Constitution says that one of its purposes is to establish justice, should we be able to recognize whether that's true or not? Has justice been established in this society? What can we point to that would help us recognize that justice has been established?
Well, it's been established imperfectly because sort of external justice as a system of rules or of jurisprudence, would never be perfect. So
okay, so you've pointed out to our system of laws and the enforcement of laws. Okay, and is that the whole of justice? Is it constrained just to the structure of laws and the enforcement laws, or is there more to justice than that?
I guess it's concerned with giving each person their due, or so to speak, of a sort of fairness. I guess impartiality.
Okay, yeah, you've brought up the four. You brought up three of the four things that are required for justice. The idea of individual claims, which you expressed when you brought up the laws and the enforcement of laws, the enforceability issue. Well, let me ask you this, just to clarify: when we want charity from someone, or we want to forgiveness, is it the habit of people to demand or to ask for that?
To ask.
And but if we say that there's an issue of justice, is it the habit of people to just ask for justice? Pretty please, may we have justice? Or do they tend to demand and insist that it's an absolute necessity?
Yeah, they tend to demand it.
Okay, so we couldn't even have a concept of justice if there's no enforceability. And the one thing that was missing, and instead of telling you what it is, I'm going to ask you questions and have you tell me.
Sure.
When we see things happen in nature, like a hurricane wipes out a town, people might think that's just not right, but do we think of it in terms of justice, or is it just nature? Is it just or unjust, or is it just nature?
So so your justice would have some sort of, I guess, culpability on someone's part,
or agency, willful agency. Yes. So see that little example right there. You can tell people stuff, or you can ask questions that are designed to get them going. Now you impress me as being someone who's already read and thought about a lot of this stuff, so it's easy here. But so now my unique perspective, I could tell you and make a claim that I have this theory of justice that's based on an ethic of personal responsibility.
Sure.
And I could tell you about that, but I could also just ask you questions too. So I'm going to ask you questions and see if I can get you to tell me. When we talk about justice, and again, we're not going to in any way, shape, or form define justice or perfectperfectly or completely or resolve this at all. We're just going to get it started. Let me, I got a note here I want to look at. Okay. Do you believe in this following principle? Would you agree with this? We should be less concerned with what we have no control over, and more concerned and attentive to what we do actually have control over.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's
so
very stoic.
yes, I deliberately put that in with there because I knew you had some Stoic philosophy going on. And so, like, for example, if you thought maybe you could change the Constitution to make it better, and yet if truly you had no control over that, that might be something you'd let go. And maybe latch on to, if your purpose is to, well, let me ask you this question first, because I have to know what you think about this. Do you believe that we as citizens in the Democratic Republic of the United States have a personal responsibility to control ourselves such that we are supporting the establishment of justice? That there's something in our daily lives that upholds justice.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Might the compliance with the law be one of those things? When we willfully obey the law, are we not enforcing the justice of the law upon ourselves?
Depends whether the law is just, I suppose.
I think that's a good comment. And in the United States, do we have an abundance of just laws? There may be some that are unjust, but is there a good range of laws that are just?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so one of the things would be obeying the law. But I want to get to the point where, is it more than that? Is there something besides law? So I have some questions about the reality of how people are with each other and the nature of justice, and I want to see what you think. Does it make sense to talk about a just law to the extent that the law is unfair?
Well, can you rephrase the question?
Well, if you, to the extent that a law that is passed is deemed to be unfair,
Yeah.
does it seem incongruous to call it a just law?
Yeah.
Okay. And then there may be some exceptions somewhere.
Sure.
And the same thing could be said for a court decision.
Yeah.
And what about a person? To the extent that we can be a just person, does it seem incongruous to call someone just in the very moment that they're being unfair?
I guess not.
So you could behave in an unfair way, and they could call that behavior just?
No.
Okay.
Well, not at that moment. I mean,
okay.
Maybe overall.
Okay, and so there's similar questions. When consider the nature of harmfulness. Is it the purpose of justice to bring harm to ourselves or to be helpful to us? Do people want justice because it's going to harm them, or do they want justice because it's helpful to their thriving and their lives?
Yeah, probably to minimize harm.
And so if I'm behaving as a citizen, does it seem incongruous to you to call me just in the very moment that I'm being harmful to other citizens?
Yes.
Okay, so we would think those two wouldn't go together. What about respect? If I'm disrespectful in a particular moment, does that seem like the time to refer to my justice, or does it seem like I'm out of sync somehow?
Yeah.
And so I'm getting at the ideas is, what do you think about the nature of human character as we behave towards other citizens, even in areas where we're not even being just, or not, we don't think of it as an issue of justice, but anytime we're disrespectful, anytime we're harmful, anytime that we're unfair, are we failing to uphold justice in some way? Even though it might not be defined in law, and it might be a little ambiguous as to how we would describe that, it does seem like we're stepping out of the realm of being helpful to supporting justice. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So here's an example where I can, these are the ways I think, but instead of just telling you what I think, I tried to ask you questions. And I apologize, I'm really awkward at this on this time limit thing. So
Sorry.
Oh no, that's okay. I'm just used to going on, having hours to do whatever. But and in this now, and again, we've been sort of jumping from topic to topic. What happens in the normal use of the Socratic method is we may be still back on the nature of what the purpose of politics is. That could go on in a series of conversations. I'm just trying to skip around a little bit to show things, and it's made a little less than organized. But
we can backtrack if we need to.
Okay, but in this case, I had the I believe that the nature of justice is its most important foundation is actually in the personal character of every person.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
instead of just telling you that, I can ask you questions. Now, you can do both in the Socratic Method. I could tell you that, and then you could ask me questions.
Yeah.
And or if I sense that you had a different view, I could ask you questions to see if we get in the same pattern. But the purpose of all the questioning is less about refuting the other, but finding what terms of agreement exist. Because if we're going to have a common ethic, a common sense of justice, a common sense of purpose, a common good,
Yeah.
Socratic conversation focuses to find that commonality in terms of agreement so that we can stand upon our agreements and
Yeah,
explore
absolutely.
exploring things from a basis of agreement.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
which is
absolutely.
the total opposite of
Yes.
of well,
Yeah.
what happens in
Yeah.
political conversations and
Yes.
stuff like
Yeah.
that.
That was one of the reasons I contacted you, because it's just so disgusting to watch. But yeah, because I think that even just sort of discussing politics in a non-confrontational way is good for people to see.
Yep. Now, one thing. Now, this is not me speaking. This is Maliti speaking,
Yeah.
my co-author, which is her pseudonym, by the way. She doesn't want her name on my essays. She's private, but she. And well, let me put it this way. I'm more of a techno geek. To the extent that any of my writing on my website, which is at www.socraticmethod.net,
Oh, yeah.
has any feeling of human depth to it anywhere, that's her. She taught me how to speak human and how to pay attention to humans and not just be
Yeah.
a robot like I used to
Yeah.
be.
Oh, I should have invited you to plug your website at the beginning. That's usually what I'll have my husband do a fly-in or something. We can put socraticmethod.net. That's what we usually do when I introduce a guest.
Okay. Now I just forgot where I was going.
Maliti is a better writer than you.
Yeah, but it was that was just illustrating. Where were we before that? Sorry.
Oh, we talked about political discourse and how it's really divisive a lot of the time.
Oh, yes, yes. So, and what I noticed, like for example, we may be rightly outraged or rightly disgusted by things that we think are incredibly harmful.
Yeah.
But I always, and Meliti always holds me accountable to remembering Socrates' claim that nobody does wrong.
Yeah.
That people are always doing what they think is good. It's just that they're ignorant.
Yes.
And and what she taught me over the years is that most of the cooperative power we have with one another is actually not in our words. It's in the cognitive energy that we have. And so I try to bite my inner tongue if if someone, like I've had conversations with diehard racists.
Yeah.
And you have to have a posture where I can't think of you in terms of my evaluations of your positions.
Yeah.
You're a human being who's more than the sum of your intellectual positions. And so there's value and depth and goodness in you. And whatever differences we have, one of us is probably ignorant anyways. So
Yeah.
I'm going to embrace you as a friend or an ally, because anytime another citizen wants to talk to me about anything that is of value, they're my friend.
Sure.
In that specific thing. So just trying to, and she would say this so much better. She should probably be here, but that positive energy of joining together in a team, to know that you're not going to be personally condemned by the other if you're honest. That
Yeah.
trust, it
Yeah.
helps people really examine their ideas, because the instant someone stops trusting me, I notice they clam up.
Yeah.
And they get defensive and they don't want to answer questions.
Yeah.
And so there's a human dynamic of basic human relatedness. It's not a method per se. It's just a philosophy
Yeah.
of hospitality. It's really a philosophy of hospitality.
Yeah. Yeah.
The part 1 and 2 of the Socratic Method, which to me describes the whole of the examined life. The one is hospitality to the stranger within. That's the inner journey of opening up to yourself. And the other is hospitality to the stranger in dialogue. And when we ask questions, it invites the other person to fill up the space. Because if I make a claim, it's the nature of knowledge to format our actions. Yeah. If I say, I know such and such, well, that means that I know how we should behave. I know how physical things should be moving. I know, and I'm taking up space. Counterclaims will say, no, back off. I'm going to take up space with something else. And but if I ask questions, I'm denying I know anything. And instinctually, people recognize that they're being invited to fill up the space. If I say, tell me about your thoughts on this, and if I don't jump on you and make counterclaims, but I'm like, well, but what about that? Tell me more.
Yeah.
That's a hospitable invitation to invite the other person to express the fullness of themselves. And when the most important thing about doing the so-called Socratic method, I just call it, to me, it's just a philosophy of human dignity in conversation.
Yeah.
Rather than anything Socratic at all. But the essence of it is, that hospitable invitation to allow another person to fill up the space. Now, you can trade places, and that's something that's recommended. Someone could ask questions, then you trade places, and the other person asks questions. But the ideal, and this is, again, not Socratic, this is the way human works, is to optimize the exchange of new information.
Yeah.
And because what happens in current political discourse and religious discourse, whenever we're talking about, and I can frame this quite precisely, whenever we're talking about values that should be forming our opinions of what the goals of life and the goals of governing a nation should be, conversation tends to shut down. People make claims and counterclaims. There's no draw of information. There's no examination of ideas. And so opening that up, whether you call it Socratic method or anything else, that structure of restricting oneself to questions, that's what does it.
Now, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay.
Do you think that that's sort of, is it a flaw within human nature to think that we know more than we do? Or
actually, it's necessary.
Okay.
It's instinctually necessary for human beings to latch on to whatever knowledge they can and blindly repeat it as quickly as possible. I don't need to philosophize about the ontology of shoe tying every time I tie my shoes. If I did that with everything, I literally would not be able to keep a schedule. I would not be able to go to work.
So you're saying it's necessary for pattern recognition and
I'm not sure how far I can get into this with digressing, but the last few years I've been doing a lot of ontology work, synthesizing ideas from Being in Time with Buckminster Fuller's ergonomic philosophy and my experience as a computer programmer, where time is actually the nature of existence itself, and measuring faster and slower is important. So when we're surviving, our instinct is to go faster.
Yeah.
If something's chasing me down to kill me, like a bear or a lion, I have to go faster. I have to react faster. I have to physically be assertive.
Yeah.
When I'm safe, I can slow down. And when I slow down, I start wondering about things like, oh, that cloud looks like a bunny. I wonder what the nature of the universe is, because I have the leisure to be able to slow down, and other cognitive faculties rise up. And so, we are instinctually compelled, and it's the purpose of all training. Whether you go to school, whether you go to the military, it's the purpose of all training to make us go faster so that we don't think and just memorize and make secondhand certain kinds of things, which makes room for our minds to operate in other ways. And so relative to that, one of the advantages of exercising reasoning about values-based things is it strengthens us to go faster when we need to. Yeah. So like, for example, if I'm stressed, it doesn't matter how physically stressed I am. I notice that after decades of doing this, I have just a little bit more margin of being able to be more thoughtful no matter what's happening than if I was completely unpracticed. If the people who are completely unpracticed at being thoughtful about in values-based reasoning about things like about the nature of the goodness and beauty in life, about their own ethics, and just thinking about stuff, tend to react in an automated way, which usually skews downward towards blunter reactions. So Socratic Method's value at this is if you can deliberately make people comfortable at questioning themselves, questioning their ideas, even if it's your religion, if it's your political party, always questioning things, it's actually necessary. Like even if your say your religion is perfectly true, say Jesus' teaching about love your neighbor as yourself. Let's just assume that's perfectly true. You can't live that unless you ask questions.
Sure.
And so it's not a matter of whether it's true or false. It's how the mind works. What does it mean to love my neighbors, myself? What does it mean to love myself? How do I love this neighbor on this particular day in this circumstance as myself? And so the more we practice questioning things, the stronger we get at it, the more apt we are to it, and the more we can do it under stress. Even when the pace is fast and physical circumstances are difficult, we can still be more thoughtful.
I'll have to keep that in mind after the last couple of months that I've had. Anything that'll help me in times of stress is good. Well, Max, do you think that this is a good place to stop, or?
Yeah, pretty much. I guess I would sum up to say that life really is a journey of self-discovery.
Yeah.
And if we cut ourselves off from asking questions and don't stay open to questions, we cut ourselves off from ourselves. And to me, the nature of the examined life is opening ourselves up first to ourselves. That was the subtitle of Hospitality to the Stranger Within. Yeah. And opening ourselves up to one another. And this is one thing that Meliti brought out to me clearest. You're not just trying to figure out what justice is or what virtue is or what the nature of good government is. You're discovering another human being who's sitting right in front of you.
Yeah. And
to take joy in that. And she's actually, I will admit, better at that than I am. She has a radiance of personal connection that is more developed than mine. And it's something I've been working on. And I'm better at it than I used to be. I used to be a bull in the china shop. I loved to just tear apart ideas, and it actually sometimes made people cry and didn't know why. And I had to learn that I just can't do that. That's wrong. I don't think I've made anyone cry, but I've made them angry. Yes, yeah. And so, for her, the first and foremost thing is her first idea is never, what we're talking about. It's what we're talking about in the context of I'm discovering you. Yeah. And she takes joy in that, and it affects people. Respond to that. She has ways of making people more open to talking with her than I do. I have to make more willful effort to. Well, anyways, I'm tangenting. Sorry. But so, practicing questioning everything in a way where you're genuinely seeking to gain knowledge. And with regard to virtue, the primary cardinal virtue of Socrates, I thought, was that he believed that knowledge wasn't enough, that you had to live it. And this was obvious in the dialogues of Plato. So the character skill, virtue, or techne in Greek, the technical skill of being able to subordinate your will to new knowledge, is just really important. It's the most important adaptive trait of humanity. Yeah. And so the practice of the examined life is a practice of the things that help us get better at that. That's great. Yeah, well, thank you so much for being my guest. We'll have to do this again. Sounds good. Yeah, and again, his website is socraticmethod.net, correct? Yes. All right, well, very good. Thank you so much. Thank you. You have a wonderful day. You too. Take care. Bye-bye.